I will start talking while people are still entering the room. Many of you came here as I was planning on coming here to hear Luba speak. Unfortunately, having avoided it for 2+ years, Luba has finally succumbed to COVID, and while she is fine, I was talking to her yesterday evening. She did not feel that she would be well enough to deliver this, and so there was a minor panic of various options to explore, and in the end, I became the presenter of last resort. In a way, I'm bailing out my own webinar series. So I've had quite a frantic morning of putting together slides, because I decided I would not spend the time talking about just one paper, but actually I would talk about a few and a couple of issues which I wanted to, I've been working on across various papers with various co-authors. So Michael Ehrman has promised that he will keep me honest on time. Let me just make sure I share my slides properly. Let me bring them back here. Okay, so share screen here. Share. Okay. So hopefully you can see those. Maybe Claudiana, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see them properly? And do they move? It has moved as well. Double thumbs up. Excellent. Okay. Okay. Well, I shall begin, and Claudiana or Michael Ehrman can tell me if they see questions that I've ignored. But I will pause every so often to sort of take any questions that come in through the chat. You can ask questions through the chat, and then if we have the usual sort of 1 hour slot plus a little carryover, and and as I said, I won't introduce myself beyond saying I'm the presenter of Last Resort, and I'll try and make this as interesting as I can. So the topic that I said I would talk about, or decided I would talk about, is the issue of credibility and communication. So let me sort of tell you the bits I'm going to touch on, and I probably won't get through all of these, but these are sort of, there's 4 papers here, but I'm going to start with a much more general discussion about the issue of credibility, and in particular the sort of credibility case for higher interest rates. And one reason I sort of want to start with that is because I think central banks right now are facing a difficult environment in which to set policy, but one in which I believe, in the interest of credibility, they really do need to be the bad guys at some level. And that's hard. And that's hard, particularly in an era where, they are now talking much more directly to the public, and the transparency has gone up, and maybe, it's a difficult time for many institutions in terms of accountability and convincing the world of the case for independent central banks. But I also think it's just really important that central banks do, make that case and make it publicly. But it's a hard one, and it's a difficult one to explain. So I don't wish that I was in the position of senior central bankers having to make this case to the public, but I do think it's important, and I'm going to try and convince you of why. And then after that, I'm going to touch on a bunch of different papers that I'm working on at the moment, where this sort of comes in different ways, or these different papers have sort of driven me to think in this particular way. But like I said, questions, comments, suggestions are always welcome. Let me sort of start here. So there's been a lot of chat on things like Twitter, and you even see it in newspapers in many countries, essentially painting central banks as being the bad guys right now. with the sort of choice that's being presented as, the central bank can raise interest rates, but in doing so, yes, it might, restore some credibility about its anti-inflationary inclinations, but in doing so will cause this massive pain to households and businesses. Versus an alternative, and again, I'm not saying this is widespread in the monetary economics community, but in the wider universe of people who think about macro policy, an idea that central banks should be providing relief to households right now and businesses, to cut interest rates, make borrowing cheaper, make it easier for them to service their existing loans. Now, I think that works, that relief provision works, but only in a world where people have become complacent about central banks. I felt it would be wild of me to get through more than 5 minutes without at least a quote from Alan Blinder, which I, a rule of mine now when I give seminars. And so this is a quote from Alan Blinder from his 2000 AER paper looking at the issue of credibility. As long as expectations matter, and how can they not, a central bank's credibility should influence how its monetary policy actions affect forward-looking variables like long-term interest rates and other asset prices. And, the Fisher equation, which, those of us who teach even to undergrads will immediately teach this this important equation that relates real interest rates to being the nominal interest rate less expected inflation. And it's underlined there, and this is where I think the complacency comes in. As long as inflation expectations are anchored, it is true that when the central bank changes its nominal rate, it changes a real rate. It's also typically true that when the central bank changes the nominal rate that it's setting, it will change household rates in the same way. So you kind of get this equivalence, and that's really the power. And that's why in most of our models that we write, we have models in which, the central bank has to ensure sort of anchored inflation expectations. Where I think the choice is false and the potential, the as long as condition may not hold, is if inflation expectations become de-anchored. So again, I quote somebody else who was very influential in my studies, Charles Goodhart, who was at the LSE when I studied there, and still is. I'm just not. He has this quote from his book: virtually every monetary economist believes the central bank can control the monetary base. Almost all those who have worked in a central bank believe this view is totally mistaken. I don't think it's true to say that correlates exactly with the control of interest rates, because central banks, of course, control their policy interest rates. But the idea that central banks have a very strong control of the interest rates that matter, so, mortgage rates, business lending rates, etc., well, that all, again, depends on their ability to retain, a well-anchored, nominal target for the economy, such that we have that relationship I just talked about, where nominal rates affect real rates and central bank rates affect other rates in the economy. And a simple way of thinking, if we think about, say, mortgage rates, the way that a bank will decide how much to charge as a nominal mortgage rate will depend on, and I've done it sort of in a linear way, of course, it's much more complicated asset pricing models of this, but you can basically think about it as the amount that they expect as a real return, as well as compensation for the sort of loss of purchasing power that they're going to get from nominal inflation moves. But there's also this term related to, we call them term premia, but you can think of them as inflation risk premia, or, there's a bunch of things going in there. And I think the bit where central banks have to make the move at the moment for inflation to take over inflation control is that if they don't, and they destroy their credibility, now again, it's not a given that they will destroy their credibility by not moving more, but if they do destroy their credibility, expected inflation by lenders goes up, which means that the rates they charge go up anyway. And their worries about it, the risk premia associated go up and the nominal rates go up. So especially if they think that the central bank will eventually have to rebuild its credibility, they may also expect that the central bank rates in the future will go up, and they'll go up by even more to reestablish credibility. And all of these feed into interest rates going up today. So again, another Alan Blinder quote. This is his definition of credible. I think in a world where credibility may not be taken as given, or inflation expectations may not be held as anchored, the choice is not really if the central bank increases interest rates, it causes pain to households and businesses, but it restores its credibility. Instead, the alternative of cutting rates is actually they will destroy the credibility. Imported goods prices will go up anyway because you tend to get an exchange rate depreciation. Plus, you get the interest rates going up anyway, the ones that matter, because the banks now have the expected inflation going up, they have the term premium going up, and they may expect that interest rates have to stay higher for longer to rebuild credibility. So it's difficult because it looks like you're choosing between lowering and making things better and raising and making things worse for households and businesses. But really the choice is, if you do end up destroying your credibility, it gets bad for households and businesses today anyway, and it will stay bad for even longer. And that's a case that I think is, really difficult for central banks to communicate, especially. So there's this famous quote. When I say famous, I think it's famous among sort of people who study central banks and think about this a lot. It's from a former Fed chair, William Martin Chesney Jr. And he described the central bank like the chaperone who has ordered the punch bowl removed just when the party was really warming up. That I think that's a sort of nice that's a nice description, particularly in sort of normal demand-driven cycles, right? When demand is going up, the party's starting to get going, and someone comes in and tries to sort of take the heat out of it. But we're not in a normal demand-driven cycle. It's very clear that there are big supply-side dimensions to what we're seeing. And again, you'll hear this cited in circles that, because of that, cost of living crisis, people are struggling. Cost of inputs rates, business are struggling. Adding interest rate hikes on top of that's just really not nice. It's not helpful. So the equivalent that I've been talking to people is, rather than taking the punch bowl away just as the party's getting going, this is like the morning after. Everybody's hungover, and the central bank is taking away the water and the painkillers, right? So people have their headache, but it's not even that they feel like they had a party. They feel like they were drinking water the night before and maybe it was spiked or something. So, this is a really nasty time to be taking away the sort of relief that you can give them. But as I said, I just don't think it's a choice. I think the credibility angle is super important. And we shouldn't forget that there is another macro policy tool, fiscal policy. It can be much more targeted, and in particular, much more targeted at those households that are most vulnerable, at businesses that are most suffering, and it can sort of act in that way. Now, I'm not going to use today to talk about, although you won't be surprised that some of what I've been talking about here has been influenced by living in the UK in the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks during which, arguably, both macro policies had to kick in. One, arguably the Bank of England was expected to raise by more, but didn't. That I don't think was a great choice. I'm not on the MPC, so it doesn't matter. Then we had a mini budget that was targeted fiscal policy, but not targeted in the way that most people would have accepted and thought was a reasonable policy choice. And then the ensuing movements of the exchange rate, the ensuing troubles in the financial system as yields went up, play out some of these issues where on both, I'm talking today mostly about central banks, but the point about credibility also applies to fiscal policy. Okay, I'm going to pause there just because I'm about to go on to talk about some specific papers on this, but I'm going to bring up the comments and see if there are any questions, or I'll ask if Ryan, Michael, or Claudiana have any questions directly.
So I haven't seen anything in the chat, but if I may, let me sort of enter one conjecture here, and that is also the starting point at which this is happening right now, right? Because we're coming out of sort of decades where inflation was low, below target, but clearly low, where the general public didn't really care much about what central banks would do, what monetary policy is, actually what inflation is. Now, all of a sudden, there's a lot of attention devoted to this. People feel it. It's now very relatable to their lives. But we come from a starting point where I think there's very limited knowledge of what central banks do, what they can do, what they cannot do. And then talking about these intertemporal trade-offs is extremely hard, right? You tell them, what, it's painful today, but you'll benefit in the long run, right? So I'm not saying there was a missed opportunity, because it was probably hard to reach the general public in the previous decades. But not being aware of monetary policy related trade-offs makes it even harder now to communicate that.
No, so I agree, and I in some other work that I do, I talk about communication with the public, and an interesting thing about the communication with the public is now it's probably the case that central banks become interesting again. So this challenge of engagement may go away, but for, as you say, almost for the wrong reasons. I don't think that takes away from the need for central banks to get out and do it in a tough time. Athanasios, I see you raised your hand, so I'm going to invite you to ask your question.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I was hoping by now, and maybe you can do this next, give us a couple of the questions that you are looking to answer, because you set up some of the challenges that central banks have. Now, I think I have a somewhat different interpretation about some of the quotes, and I can give you my interpretation of the challenge, actually responding to what Michael Ehrman just pointed out, but I wanted to hear your questions first. So the way I would interpret what Michael Ehrman just said is that there was a missed opportunity in the past several years for central banks to communicate better. But I think that academics are part of the problem here. I think part of the problem is that from the academic side, we have not, I'm going to call myself the academic side now for a minute, I'm going to put different hats. I don't think we have succeeded in explaining to central bankers that if they want to be credible, they want to communicate very well, not only the loose targets, inflation at infinity is going to be 2% or something that nobody can verify in practice, but also specifics about the strategy that is to be followed, the reaction function, the policy rule. I think this is where we've seen a major failure in the past few years, and this is what is creating the difficulty right now. If central banks had communicated the reaction function that they were ready to follow, then it would have not been a surprise at all that interest rates would have to be increasing right now and balance sheets would have to be declining at all. The problem I see is that a lot of effort has been spent in the past 10 plus years talking about forward guidance and communicating the future path of policy instruments while trying to keep as much discretion as possible to do anything you would want and never be tied down to what the strategy is. I think this is the tension that creates a current difficulty. I think from our side, it's a mistake that we did not push central banks to be clearer on what the reaction function is, and instead fell for the idea that just giving forward guidance, which could be cheap talk about future policy, is good enough. So I'd like to get your view on this, and whether this would describe one aspect of the questions you're looking for.
Okay, fantastic. Right. So I'm gonna go back now and let me. So I put that as the kind of policy context. Let me give the very quick overview of these 4 papers, and it turns out that you and I are going to agree quite a lot on this stuff. So in the work with Anna and Stephen and Song, that's one where we look inside the FOMC, and I'll talk to you a little bit more in detail about that, because it can seem like, at least if I look over the last year and a half, that central banks did spend a lot of time thinking about forward guidance or worrying about it, and some engage in it a lot. Some don't like to do it because they don't want to be seen as a commitment. But what was really striking in this work, we went into that work interested about uncertainty. And what uncertainty they face. And we find that a big part of the uncertainty they face is about their worries about losing the nominal anchor and having to continually communicate that again, probably they don't exactly communicate their reaction function perfectly, but that they think about this, and they talk, particularly at times when the economy is looking pretty good, that they talk about their communicating their dedication to fighting inflation. So I'll show you some of that. In the next 2, I go exactly to show that a lot of what it is this is work with Tim Monday, and the other in work with Robert Byrne, Dave Byrne, Robert Goodhead, and Conor Parle, Central Bank of Ireland and ECB colleagues. These are essentially about this issue of whether we have to focus on, as our models would say, full information, rational expectations models would say, you just communicate the reaction function, and then the only, once you've done that, the only thing that matters on top is forward guidance. I actually go further than I think you were alluding to. A big part of the reaction function is your conjunctural assessment. How do you view the inflation numbers, etc., and how you're thinking about them and how they're interacting, and that, it turns out, we show empirically matters, at least for market reactions. And in the paper with Tim, we look explicitly at whether when the Fed sort of seems to be moving its reaction function, whether the markets get that. And the answer is they do get it, but this tends to be endogenous, not exogenous, and that has implications for a big part of the empirical literature. And then lastly, in the last paper, which I'm sure I won't have enough time to get onto, but I won't get through most of these, in the paper with Ryan, who's here today, we look at a very specific aspect, and that's something which more relates to how the central bank is performing and how that affects how people use it. So we actually run some experiments where the participants are shown different forecast performance, and then incentivized in their inflation forecasting, and we show that actually there are some really interesting effects of forecast performance. So if you're seen to be a good forecaster, you have much greater control over expectations updates than, particularly if you've recently made a number of big errors. And again, I think this raises a sort of challenge for central banks, particularly at this time, as Michael Ehrman was alluding to, where maybe for most people they've never thought about the central bank, and suddenly they're, for the first time in their working lives, having to think about it. But let me jump in and quickly show you some of the work with Anna, Stephen, and Song. I'll skip through that stuff. I mean, for me at least, the key takeaway, and this is stuff. So a working paper version of this sort of exists, but we're redrafting it now with this look at credibility. But it's an empirical paper, but there is a sort of theory section. So let me run through. I don't want to. I know not everybody likes to see equations, but I keep them pretty simple. If you think about a very standard loss function, so quadratic in output and inflation losses, probably overcomplicated the notation here for today, but I was literally copied and pasted from a Philadelphia Fed seminar I gave recently. You can think about interest rates as having an effect on lowering output and lowering inflation. So if you raise interest rates, you take off. If you think pi bar 0 is the sort of modal or mean outcome in this case under the baseline, and then if you raise rates, you're going to take delta off that, and you're going to take phi off of output. You can sort of solve through the maths and think about a world where the distributions of these outcomes can be different under the two interest rate decisions, and it gives you quite a simple decision rule. Ignore some of the terminology on this equation, but essentially there's a term related to the size of the deviation of inflation from target and the size of the deviation of output from target or from trend. Now, so if you think about this as you think about a positive demand shock, you think you're above. Essentially, the decision to raise rates would be, we will raise if we are sufficiently above, where sufficient is relative to some parameters of how powerful my interest rate is. But you also get these additional terms, the last two terms, which relate to the difference in variance in outcomes under the two policy rates. So on screen, what's sigma squared pi 1? That's how volatile the distribution of inflation will be under a raised rate, and the sigma squared pi 0 would be the variance of inflation outcomes under no change. Now, in most of our models, the shocks that we have hitting are independent of the choice of policy. They're usually additive Gaussian shocks, and and so in that sense, this change is 0. And in that world, you get no effect of uncertainty on the economy, on the policy. It can affect the economy, but not the policy. So I'll skip this bit. So that's what we call certainty equivalence. So if the variance is exogenous or is not affected by the policy choice, and when you have sort of symmetrically distributed distributions of future outcomes, as is typically the case in the sort of standard, if I pick up some of these books off my shelf, you're going to get a world where higher volatility of the shocks or lower is not going to affect. So the distribution of the expected future outcomes doesn't end up mattering. So another way in which uncertainty matters for policy is where uncertainty is itself the shock. So you could think about a world. So Nick Bloom has and many others have papers where uncertainty, say by households, is itself going to lead to them cutting back their consumption. Firms are going to cut back their hiring and investment. And therefore, these come through as shocks. And in response to that, the central bank should ease policy. Again, that is an effect on policy, but it's an effect that comes entirely through, your beliefs about what's happening in the economy. It comes through the sort of left-hand side of this equation, if you will, and not so much because of the uncertainty itself coming through. But the nice thing in this framework is you can show that, if, and this is a big if, so I'll have to then go and convince you that it may be true. If we're in a world where these distributions or that, they're not normally distributed and the variance and even the skew depend on the choice of interest rate, then you break certainty equivalence and you actually change the decision rule that people would follow. And now this is a very simple static framework, but in the paper, we're sort of looking also at the idea that those effects of policy may change over the cycle. So again, if you're If you're in a deep recession, you might worry not at all about losing the nominal anchor up. You might even be worrying about losing it towards deflation. Or, you know, if the economy's doing really quite well, and you're, you know, with all the uncertainty about what is the trend rate, when will inflation kick in, you may start to worry about it more. And then you think actually raising rates could sort of restrain the distribution of inflation that I'm going to face. But this is just a framework to think about this, and why in many of our models it's hard to generate big effects of uncertainty, and yet policymakers talk about it all the time. So then we measured it. I'll skip this. We measure uncertainty as expressed by the Federal Open Market Committee members in the meeting, so using the transcript. So we have data up until 2016. So like many of you, I'm sure the transcripts of the last year, 2 years are going to be very interesting, but we got to wait until they're released after a 5-year lag. So the gray series in the back are, you know, they're reasonably noisy, but you can see this is just a smooth version, and you can see that you can measure, and we measure specifically how much they're worried about inflation by, you know, using natural language processing, and similarly on the economy. And in theory, you can do it over many other dimensions, but these are the two that we sort of focus on. The other thing we do is we measure their stance. So for those who are not closely following this stuff, the FOMC, when they meet, they tend to, I mean, they have many parts of the meeting, they have a full agenda, but in it is what I've always called the economy round. So this is where they go around the table, the staff present, and then there's questions to the staff, and then they go around the table of the members of the Federal Open Market Committee, and those FOMC members will express their views on the economy without necessarily talking about how they should, you know, change rates or not in response to that. And then there's a second policy round where, again, the staff present some views, typically from, well, what used to be called blue books, but are now part of the teal books. And they'll present the different options, and then the staff, the members will again go around and discuss. You can measure, again, using natural language processing, you know, the policy stance that's being expressed in voice. Okay, now you can see, and we explore this in the paper, this turns out these measures, so we have a hawkish index and a dovish index, and then you have the net index here shown on the right. This thing predicts the stuff you would expect it to predict. It has the business cycle properties that you would expect. And so we use that. And a nice thing about using that is 2 dimensions. One, it picks up when the committee chooses to change language, even if they don't alter the policy rate. So, you know, I guess people who tune into this webinar are very comfortable with this idea, but the general view that monetary policy is just the interest rate is, of course, wrong. There's many asset purchase or asset sale type channels, but also the statement that matters. And so adjusting language in that can itself send these signals. So we then sort of look at the effect of these measures of uncertainty. And I mean, I'm going to focus on the inflation one, and I don't have all of the results. There's tons of results on this, but one that's really strong and incredibly robust is the fact that when FOMC members are expressing greater concern about inflation, they tend to talk more with hawkish language. So there's this link in the meetings, and this includes controlling for the green books and other expressions of sentiment. And again, there's another table in the paper where you can repeat this regression, but include external measures of uncertainty. And external measures of uncertainty tend to eat up the economic uncertainty. So the economic uncertainty, which tends to lead to more dovish behavior, so talking towards cutting rates or loosening policy, that's pretty well correlated by external measures of uncertainty. So you can think about that, or I think about that as being like the demand shock channel. The world is more uncertain. The central bank reacts by tending to lower rates. Whereas the inflation one is actually negatively correlated with those external measures. So it's certainly not being picked up in, say, Baker, Bloom and Davis, or even VIX, so traditional measures that have been used. And it tends to lead to more hawkish behavior. So we were very interested in this. We sort of were digging into what was causing this. And again, what's interesting is, you can compare it to measures of uncertainty or disagreement in the wider world. And you have these periods, and I'm going to focus on the period sort of between the post-dot-com boom recession, so the early 2000s, and the global financial crisis. And you had this period in 2003, 4, 5, 6, where the members themselves became increasingly worried about inflation. And you didn't get that in the markets. And actually, I'll show you in a moment that you didn't get it among the staff of serving the Federal Open Market Committee either. You can see that there are, of course, occasions where these differ, but in general, the correlation with the real economy stuff is much better. And if I put on VIX instead of this is blue chip dispersion measures, you also get a positive and strong correlation. But this is comparing these indices by the staff, and this is for growth now for the economy. You can see that they're pretty closely correlated. At least certainly their moves are highly correlated. Whereas this is the members of the committee in black and the staff in red. So if I was looking at the staff measure, yes, there was some increasing worries about inflation around 2004, but they kind of fell back to around their average level of worry up until the financial crisis. Whereas the members of the committee reached sort of record levels of worries and concerns about inflation. And again, they eventually sort of come back, but they come back only much more slowly. And what's interesting is even in this period, by the time we're at the European, sovereign debt crisis, members of the FOMC are worrying about the inflationary impact of all of their QE. And so we sort of dug into this. And one thing that you can see is you can actually start to see how they're worried about a takeoff in inflation. Okay. And so there's some quotes here. So this is from the May 2004 meeting. When we update the working paper, you'll be able to read a full narrative of this from the transcripts. But, there's this growing sense, even in 2004, of Geithner, who actually took a while to converge on some of the more hawkish members of the committee, talks about the risks of being late compared to the risks of moving too early being now more symmetric. And we need to adjust our statement to sort of position that if it does start to look like the economy is stronger than we maybe thought before, that we're going to be ready to act. And Bernanke, who at the time was chair, talks about this risk management perspective. We weigh the risk of significantly impeding the labor market recovery against the risk of having to scramble to adjust unexpectedly to adverse inflation developments. So again, this is this sort of delicate balance that policymakers are weighing in their head that, again, doesn't come through in most of our models. You go to the next meeting, and the next meeting is interesting because it's the moment at which they started a hiking cycle to move rates from 1%, which was their level after the early noughties recession, up onto 5.25, where they reached in June 2006. You can see Geithner has sort of swung a bit more and is now starting to worry himself about inflation expectations, and others who were much more hawkish before, like McMahon from Dallas. He's unambiguous in his view of this as the developing risk. And now this continues. And so, I had Janet Yellen up here. She was actually much more sanguine than other members. So again, this idea of risk management is not that they all share a common view of this. But even when she was more sanguine, she did agree that inflation risks were somewhat tilted to the upside. And therefore it's worth increasing a little bit. But what's really interesting is how she sort of then talked about implementing it. This is for people of this on this webinar. In implementing monetary policy, it seems to me that actions matter, but so do words. And I wanted to briefly open up the question of the statement. I think for today, the words of alternative B should suffice, but Vincent has repeatedly suggested, and a number of you have emphasized, that we need to consider how to modify the statement language. And she even then pushed to take the language from a more hawkish statement that had been proposed in order to eliminate the balance of risk statement and policy accommodation language, and emphasize the measured pace phrasing. So again, this is what, having gone through this sort of relatively long period of looking at the FOMC, it really does seem like the uncertainty that they face and this balancing act they're doing is exactly where these risks are and how those risks might play out, and to position yourself at times to ensure that your credibility is maintained. Right. Well, I'm going to pause there again, because I also realize that if Athanasios has been in these meetings and I have not, so I've just read the accounts. So if he has any comments, I'll take them.
Let me just say this is lovely. I think this is what you're doing is nice. You can actually compare this language things going back to the 90s as well. And there is a lot of material that is very useful. And you're right that we're going to have to wait, I guess 4 more years to see how the pandemic was handled, where it's massive. You still haven't quite addressed the question I have, which is when we're talking about communication, what is it that we want central banks to do, and what is it that you think? You mentioned the Bank of England's example the last couple of weeks has gone wrong, and is it the forward guidance? Is it the failure to communicate a policy rule and the fact that this creates the uncertainty about what are these policymakers going to do next time or a year from now, since they are still refusing to tell us what the policy rule is? They're just giving us these vague promises that in the long run we're going to have 2% inflation, which is kind of not good enough for figuring out. So I'm still waiting for you to get to that point.
It's coming slowly but surely. It's coming. But Claudiana wants to ask.
Thank you, Michael. I have a question on the chart that you showed, that there is kind of a shift or difference between the staff and the members in terms of uncertainty about inflation. So first question, maybe you can show who are these members, maybe presidents versus governors. And I wonder if this is the same as the case for forecast. Remember in the Romer and Romer papers, when they discuss Green Book forecast versus the FOMC members forecast, and if actually they are helpful or giving some extra information. And then the research showed that there is a difference between the forecast of the staff versus the forecast of FOMC members. They might be more as a way to persuade each other. So I wonder if there is as well some kind of display into the uncertainty of FOMC members.
Right. Okay. So this is actually at the aggregate level, but you can do all of these at the individual level, and we don't have a long enough history of their individual forecasts. We only have that small, 2 per year extract that we got from David Romer's Freedom of Information requests. But in that window, we can show you that these measures when we measure them at the individual level of inflation and economic sentiment, correlate well with forecasts. But that once you control for those, you don't get any effect of the PMU on the forecasts. And we include these sentiment measures in these regressions anyway. So we go to great lengths to show that this is not there, just they have a worse outlook. It's actually even controlling for that. It really does look like it's some higher order moments going on. But again, yeah, it's a bit short to show you all of that. But that's what a big part of the paper was thinking about.
No, so I wondered if actually they use this uncertainty as a way to bargain with each other. So
sure, maybe, yeah,
like the forecast.
Okay, yeah. But then we can also show you it changes the language and it changes market surprises. So that's fine. I'm okay with that. That's how policy works. that's okay. Michael, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This is a clarification question. It seemed to me that you're using inflation concerns, worries, and uncertainty as synonyms here. So I got confused what you're actually measuring. This is called PMU. I think U stands for uncertainty, because I can be very concerned even in case of very little uncertainty. You know, if inflation is very high or very low relative to target, I might be very concerned, but it could be low uncertainty. So you seem to have used this as synonyms, and it's not clear to me because, you know, depending on whether this is a concern or whether this is uncertainty, might have different hypotheses on how this affects my language.
No, that's a fair comment. So we can show, I mean, the way we measure it, we are trying to measure uncertainty, but it's incredibly difficult to measure it perfectly. So the way we do it is we use word embedding. So within the context of the FOMC transcripts, we take the words that are used in language according to the embeddings approach as most like synonyms for uncertainty. And then, you know, there's a few of them that we strip out because they're also synonyms for state of the economy and they're in sort of sentiment, if you want. So we try and purge them, but we're doing it with language, and unfortunately they don't reveal the standard deviation of their perceived, you know, uncertainty around some parameter of a model, which is, you know, if we thought we were trying to test Brainard uncertainty, we would want. So you're right. I mean, I think that's just so we do in the paper go to great lengths to try and convince you that we've done it in ways that in the corpus is capturing uncertainty, but there'll always be that residual. I don't think we can get away from that.
Thanks. There's also a question in the chat, and I told you I would remind you of time. We're 45 minutes. You had 1 out of 4 papers so far.
Yeah, that's okay. But okay, so I'm going to pause the question. So the question I'll come back to at the end on the more recent stuff, because so Caroline, you're going to have to wait just a little bit. Let me jump on because I was okay. So now the question. So now let me go more into the request about what is it that central banks have to communicate. Well, okay, so I'm going to answer that. I'm still going to keep Athanasios a little bit annoyed with me because I don't know if I can answer that perfectly. But what we can do is we can ask the question, well, we know that when central banks talk, they release information. And so in this work with PhD student, well, actually, he's just passed his PhD, so maybe former PhD student, Tim Monday, we look at when central banks communicate and they generate surprises, what is the nature of those surprises? Now, people have used surprises a lot. I'm going to show you a little bit more maths because I think it matters for this. But you can sort of think in a world. So now we can think about this, you know, this f of x is their reaction function. So x is the state of the economy, and then they have their coefficients. And then, you know, if they just communicated this perfectly, then there should be no surprises, except if they add some exogenous Romer type shock to it. Okay, but we know, and maybe this was the complaint that Athanasios was saying, you know, we don't know exactly what this function is. We see decision, so we see an interest rate, but markets have formed some expectation of that. You know, they form some expectation of what the choice would be. Well, you can kind of decompose this and you can break it into various things. Now, if, like a lot of the literature, you think their reaction function coefficients are fixed, then, you know, we get this really sort of neat distinction between the information effect. This is the coefficients multiplied by the new information that's released. And we get this shock surprise. So the bit of the exogenous additive Romer-Romer shock that we hadn't forecast. Now, actually, if you allow their reaction function to be time varying, if you allow them to change how they react to data, then you actually get extra things. You get a reaction function surprise, you get that interacting with the information surprise, and you get a bunch of sort of covariance elements as well. Okay, but in the paper, we talk a little more about that. But let me just show you something. If you imagine that the central bank has a reaction function, but you allow that reaction function to switch between two different modes. So we're thinking about a sort of Markov switching world. Now, is 2 the right number? I don't know, but it's, you know, it's greater than 1, and it's this, you know, it's the smallest whole number greater than 1. So we look at that world, we estimate a model, and that model predicts for the US when they think the Fed was in different modes, okay? And so we're allowing for 2. And what you see is that there are far more surprises in the market in the gray shaded areas, which are the modes that the model estimates as being their kind of most save the world mode, the least sort of tough on inflation. In fact, if you were to look at them in a DSGE model on its own, that they would not lead to what we strive for in terms of determinacy. But we know that if you're switching modes, you don't have to have determinacy in every world. You just have to have it enough that you pin down the sort of the off equilibrium behavior. And you see this is both equity, this is the absolute value of equity surprise and interest rate. You explain a lot of the surprises, most of the surprises occur in these periods where the central bank seems to be responding less aggressively. This is really consistent with the work of Michael Bauer and Eric Swanson. It's consistent with Anna Cieslak's review of financial studies paper, which shows that a big chunk of the surprises come on the cut decisions, where the market seems to be repeatedly surprised about them switching into this more dovish save the world mode. Okay. If you're worried about, you know, the separation between information effects and monetary policy shocks, you see even there, if you split them according to Yaroskinsky-Karady, you see similar effects. Okay. So then what we do in the paper is we take the reports of a very large, well-known Wall Street investment house, and we look literally at the reports that they release on the day and the day after the FOMC decision. Now, so you know, this is quite a big exercise to go through all of their years. You know, I'm in the process of updating it to the more recent stuff, which is again interesting and exciting. But you can see that there are lots of times that they are not surprised, but they are on occasion surprised. And when they're surprised, we can split it into which of these different things they seem to be talking about. And what you see is that they are mostly surprised about these first 3 things. The assessment that the central bank is revealing about the economy, not the information. It's not that, you know, this, you know, that the market, the Wall Street economists didn't know about core inflation or didn't know about producer price inflation. But they might be surprised that they're interpreting the inflation to be transitory or more persistent than had been the case before. Or they say they're expressing a preference, which would be they're going to respond more aggressively to this inflation, or some mix of the two. So that's really it. Now this has implications that, in the interest of time, I won't go into here, but we go into in the paper. This really matters for our models. This really matters for how we think of these things. So even the things that we think of as, right, reaction function surprises, these tend to be endogenous. They tend to come with a reason of, I'm doing this because we think inflation expectations will be de-anchored, or we think something else. Again, that's consistent with what the central bank was worrying about in the paper with Anna and Stephen and Song that I talked about first. I'm not going to take questions now because I want to get that was the second paper done in quick fashion. And this one's going to follow almost directly from that. Because then when you think about, this is the work with apologies to my co-authors, the names are at the start, but they've disappeared from this slide. So this is Dave, Rob, and Connor and myself. I'll skip through this. You know, again, the way we think about what in the work with Tim we called assessment. This is like they're looking at the same data everybody else is looking at, and they're forming a view of the world. We argue that you can think about this in 2 steps. Now, this is, so Michael, you and I have discussed this very recently when I presented it in Stockholm, but you know, it's kind of artificial to split it into these 2 steps. It's just to get people in their head to think, yeah, we look at the data, we make an assessment of where we are, then we project, then we react, and we go. If you want, you can think about the reaction function as the sort of nonlinear combination of all the steps. That's not how we've tended to model it in theoretical models, but maybe that's fine. Again, the point we make is, and this I'm going to try now and get even firmer on part of the interpretation. If you buy this, then you buy the central bank's assessment as part of its reaction function. And so going to the question that Athanasios has asked me to answer, one of the things that the central bank needs to communicate is how it is assessing the world, how it is looking at the same data that everybody else has and what it sees. Now, this is not just forward guidance. So this is the sense in which I really agree that the focus on forward guidance is potentially misplaced. There were times that forward guidance was an extra tool, but part of the bread and butter of central banks should be to communicate how they are thinking about the world and its likely evolution. That's not forward guidance. That's really communicating your assessment function. And this doesn't matter in our standard models, because in our standard models, current output and inflation are perfectly measured. But we know, Athanasios, from your early work, we know that real-time policymaking and ex-post policymaking are different things. And part of that comes in this assessment function. Essentially, everybody is having to filter. Now, that might be a difficult communication exercise, but it's a necessary one. So I will skip through this. I want to add one thing, which I think is very cool in this paper, is we look at questions from journalists to the ECB after their press conference as a way of getting a gauge on what type of things they're interested in. And you see they're a mix of future and past. There's a methodological contribution for those who do NLP of how to measure temporal dimensions of text, which sounds like it should be easy, but I promise you it's not. But you can see the type of questions. You know, here's one. I'll just show this one. You mentioned inflation expectations as something very important to the Governing Council. If I've got this right, inflation expectations in a number of countries are actually quite high, higher than they have been, or at levels around at the time of the euro changeover. Can you talk a little bit about how that is figuring into your expectations and calculations? Again, I don't want to say that they're not concerned about the reaction function. They clearly are, but a big part of the reaction function is how the central bank is assessing the information, and that's where this also comes in. There's some more questions there, and some assessment. But let me pause there, and because at least then, if I start eating into our overflow time, I've done 3 of the 4, so I feel like I can almost be ready to stop. Okay, if nobody's going to jump in now, I'm going to very quickly do the last one, which is some of the stuff with Ryan. Again, I'm not going to do the whole thing. I hope he will come on some point and do this himself. But you know, we've been running experiments, which is one of the cool things about macro, is that now it's acceptable to do experiments. And that's what Luba was going to speak about. And when we get her on, she will speak about this certainly more coherently than I can, because I'm this sort of newbie trying to learn how to do experiments, and Ryan is teaching me. But what we do is the following. We show people who are paid to be participants, we show them a past of central bank performance. Let me see if I have any of them. So you can look here. You could see this is 12 quarters, and the red is actual inflation, and the blue is what the central bank had forecast inflation would be in before it got there. And then after you show them that, you ask them for a first set of forecasts, and then you tell them you ask them their forecast for period 13, and then you give them the central bank's forecast for period 13, and you give them a chance to update their forecast. And then you do everything in the clever way, whereby, the amount they get paid extra on top of their participation fee will depend on the accuracy of their point and range forecasts. And so they're fully incentivized to give the right answer. And you then see how different performance affects whether they update or not. And just in the interest of sort of wrapping up, I'll just tell you that in general, they do pretty well. They, when the central bank is great, they put a high weight on it. And when it's terrible, they put a much lower weight on it. And that works pretty well for these type of experiments. This is like we think about as just their general forecasting performance. What we then do is we take three situations. This consistent has the same average forecast as, one of the reasonably bad forecast performances from before. And then early and late have the exact same average forecast errors, except in early, they make their forecast errors in quarter 1 to 4, but then they're pretty damn good. And in late, they're pretty damn good, and then they make their errors towards the end. And when you do that, you do see a very different reaction to the central bank's forecasts. So if I focus here on the chart on the left, you can see that they actually really sort of downweight the performance, particularly when they've done really badly recently. Now, why do I mention that? Well, central banks are often, and macroeconomists are often, judged on their forecasts. And for anybody, I spent my start of my career doing forecasts at the Bank of England. I think forecasting, getting it right, is really hard. And not because you're not trying, not because you're bad, but just because it's hard. And so the idea that this can influence the effect that you have on people's updating is something that we should worry a lot about and think carefully about in our communication. But let me skip through that, and I will stop there. And I see there's one question in the comments that I have to which I'll come on to, but I'll pause before I answer the specific questions and see if Athanasios or Michael, Ryan or Claudiana have anything they want to come back on.
Let me just say that you got much closer to what I was asking before. So I think this is very nice, and in the future we'll be able to get to it. So it would be useful to actually see your reaction to the questions online.
Okay, good. Okay, so let me get. I'm going to start with Ben Norman's question. So, hi Ben. So is it possible to articulate one assessment function for monetary policy committees where individuals each have? No, that's part of the challenge. That's part of the reason why the idea, I think, of a fixed coefficient reaction function is a really difficult thing, because you have committees like the Bank of England's MPC where individuals have a vote. That of course can change the reaction, because people vote in different ways, and the aggregation may not be simple. But even committees that historically have been more dominated by, say, a chair, even there, I think the idea of a single fixed assessment function is just not right. At least so actually I'm going to reminisce for a second. Ben and I both worked under Andrew Bailey in the international division. And a lot of our job day to day would have been looking at the data and trying to come up with a view of where the countries are and where they're going. the idea that we have a fixed mapping from a couple of limited number of state variables just to me doesn't really make sense. Then Caroline's question is, with regards to the BOE struggles of the last fortnight, isn't it also a question of how market maker of last resort role is enacted? Thinking of lender of last resort principles, having some constructive ambiguity in the communication of reaction functions to respond to moral hazard. Yeah, okay, so I was going to try and stay out of the last 2 weeks of my. Actually, let me stop sharing. I don't need to show anymore. I was going to try and stay out of the difficulties of the last 2 weeks in the UK. I mean, I think what we saw is that the idea of fully independent policies, both within central banks but also across macro policy institutions, is not as strong as perhaps we've made it out to be. So, the bank had to take actions for financial stability reasons. I think these have caused people to ask questions about their monetary reaction function. A lender of last resort is not the same thing as quantitative easing, but it does look a little bit weird if you're committed to tightening, quantitative tightening, so you're going to sell assets in a market while at the same time, because of financial stability worries or lender of last resort type inactions or market maker of last resort, you then have to also be buying them at the same time. I think that's difficult. But I think it also highlighted to us, we had lots of people in the last while, and this is partly what motivated my motivating case for higher rates based on credibility. There were plenty of people, including politicians, including the current Prime Minister, who were making soundings about changing the remit of the Bank of England, getting rid of their focus on inflation in order to make them more growth friendly. Now, that very clearly, in the same world of my case for why central banks may have to raise rates, even if it's a bit nasty, if you start to mess with the credibility directly through the institutional setup, I think it becomes difficult. It becomes difficult because markets immediately start to worry about these things. Rates go up anyway. And what we saw was probably, I can't remember the exact numbers, probably other people were watching them more closely than me, but before the Thursday MPC meeting, I think the expectation was that interest rates would reach a peak of around 4.5, something like that, not dissimilar to the rates that I think were predicted for the US and the Eurozone. Eurozone has always been a bit lower, actually. After the MPC didn't raise rates as much as had been expected, that rate didn't really move that much. Maybe it actually almost went up a little bit, but the mini budget sent it up, and I think at some point it peaked somewhere above 6. And now with all the backtracking, etc., it's down from that height, but I think it's still above 5 as of today. So you can kind of see immediately the impact that messing with credibility has on the yield curve and where things go. And so I think so going back to Caroline's question, yes, it matters how you define these things. Yes, it matters how you define these different policies. But we also have to recognize that, if we start stirring the pot in one area, we may be forced to take actions that make monetary policy harder because we've had to intervene on the financial stability side because of something that was enacted on the fiscal side. So I think the interactions are actually a lot more complicated, certainly than we've let on for years of talking about independent policy.
Can I have a word on this?
Please.
This is one of the things I found very, very useful for this discussion in Caroline's question is the notion of constructive ambiguity, and then the explanation for it that this may be a way to respond to moral hazard. And what I wanted to note here is that I don't think we should be letting central banks, again, along the lines of what I was mentioning before, to find such easy excuses for obfuscation and for lack of transparency. So there are very, very few contexts in which ambiguity actually is constructive. And I would actually urge researchers to tell us, is it really constructive whenever central banks claim that it is, and this is why they are not as transparent as they should be? And and even on this occasion, I'm not convinced that there is any constructive element to the ambiguity about what the central bank is doing, even on financial stability concerns. And this was not a situation with a concern about a possible failure of a financial institution. This was about market functioning, where it's even harder to bring moral hazard concerns into play.
Can I ask you then on that? Okay, so let's. So this is a discussion that Michael and I had very recently. Okay, so in a world where the central, I've drunk my own Kool-Aid, so I believe that the central bank, part of what it's doing is assessing the state of the world, and it does so in a way where I do not think central bankers are, I think they're wonderful people, but I don't think they're magically all-knowing, all-seeing individuals. And so they're also learning what's going on. If we go back to last October, September, we were all, there was this debate about team transitory, team persistent, and etc. At what frequency should a central bank communicate? Let's say I'm the central bank and I know that they want to know how I'm thinking about inflation, but I'm Bayesian and I know there's a probability it's transitory, it's a probability it's permanent, and I'm trying to weigh that up myself. How often should I be transparent, right? So should I be transparent once every 8 weeks or every 6 weeks at the meeting, or should I be transparent, every morning? Should I send a tweet every morning saying the latest data have me thinking 78% transitory, or, so there is a question about, I'm with you on that we have to be transparent, but when I don't know the answer, how frequently should I tell you I'm revising my views? Because if it's me, I revise my views a lot. I should weigh everything. But how do you answer that?
Well, let me give you the Brunner and Melzer answer to this. When they first formulated the Shadow Market Committee, they then decided to have those meetings only twice a year. And one of the things they wanted to do is send a message to policymakers that as long as you have a systematic policy framework, it doesn't really matter if you meet on a daily or monthly basis. At the time, the Fed was meeting once a month, policy meeting every month. It's not even necessary. So less frequent meetings are fine as long as you have a systematic framework and people can actually see how you are going to respond to the incoming data. So clearly, markets will be revising their assessment on a daily basis. The policymakers don't have to do that. That would be simply too much work and too much noise. We know, you said that you've been doing forecasts. I've never done forecasts myself, but I know it's a very, very difficult exercise to do. I don't think I would want central banks to be doing more than 4 times a year a complete forecast. And I agree with you that a lot of effort should go into explaining what the forecast is. So I don't think you need to be responding to every piece of information to be transparent. What you want to be is transparent in explaining how you will respond to changes in the state variables. I consider the near-term outlook for inflation a state variable, both the baseline path and the uncertainty about that. So it's not current inflation; it's really the near-term outlook. When it comes to financial stability, it gets trickier. It gets trickier, but I think we want to move in a direction where we are also better in communicating systematic policy response to financial stability concerns instead of the constructive ambiguity, is what I was mentioning before. Constructive ambiguity would have been used to hide transparency even for day-to-day monetary policy decisions 50 years ago. And now we know better. Now I think we can have a convincing case that communicating a policy reaction function more clearly is helpful, is beneficial. I think similarly, we should get closer to that in financial stability and crisis management considerations.
Good. Excellent. Well, I like I said, at 10 o'clock this morning, I was not sure that I would fill 20 minutes of discussion, let alone the whole thing. And I apologize to those of you who came late and expected Luba and got me. That is an unfortunate side effect of the illness, but Luba will be back with us at some point. I will keep you posted on that. Let me thank everybody for their questions. I'm not going to thank myself for talking, but I am going to, having had a very stressful day, I'm going to go and have a...
I think the other Michael should thank you for talking. All right.
So thank you, Michael, for picking up this at the very last minute. No, I think this was great.
Good. Okay, excellent. Good to see everybody. And yeah, we'll see you next month. Oh, there's one question that's just come in. Oh, no, well done. Thank you, Alessandro. Yes, excellent. Thank you, everybody, and see you next time.